Well, hello YouTube, it's me, Fortmaster, and welcome back to another overly sarcastic productions reaction. Welcome to Super School. Oh yeah, that's a trope, alright. I mean, how many can I just think of off the top of my head? I mean, of course, there's like Hogwarts. There was that Camp Half-Blood from Percy Jackson, that was it. And then, I mean, those are the only two I can think of off the top of my head, but I know for like basically a 100% fact, I've seen like a super school thing in like, oh, My Hero Academia. Yeah, that's another one because, you know, the entire first section of that show revolves around like MA or MHA. It's been a while since I watched. I mean, it just seems to be the way of things, isn't it? If you have a show that focuses on younger characters, such as children or the like, or teens also at the very late end, inevitably there's going to be some sort of magic school, or super school in this case, to actually teach them how to use their fantastical powers. So as always, original video is linked in the description if you haven't seen it yet for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day, and with all that being said, let's get enrolled then, shall we?
There's something a little funny and a little more horrifying about how one of the most common stress dreams for adults and kids alike is to be back in school, unprepared for a test, or somehow forgetting an entire class commitment, or brutally disappointing a teacher, or somehow all at once. I know I've had all three flavors of nightmare at one point or another, and I graduated fully 5 years ago. I did my time, earned my grades, got my fancy piece of paper that says I know what a Markov chain is. I'm free now. But it makes sense that my subconscious hasn't really caught up with that.
I'm trying to think, have I ever had one of those dreams? I've only ever remembered like 3 dreams in my entire life. Of course, I remember, you know, having dreams much more times than that. But it's that whole thing of where unless you like focus on remembering the dream as soon as you wake up, then it just sort of like evaporates from your memory. And I've had that a couple of times where like, oh, that was a cool dream. And then I'll wake up and actually start doing stuff. And it's like, man, what was that? Wait, what was the dream again? Ah! Actually, I mean, thinking about it, I think maybe like it's technically 4 dreams that I remember. Because I think like the very first, like, anything like sleep related I remember, like dream wise, it was almost like, it was so weird. It was basically like if you had like black and white silent film footage of like cars and other weird machines, like, you know, those videos where they show early like flying machines and there's this one machine that has like an umbrella that's going up and down and it's bouncing car all over the place. It was sort of like film like that, and it was just being like projected on the inside of my eyeballs, like the inside of my eyelids, I mean. And that's like the first dream I ever remember. And it was, I mean, what does that even mean? I mean, I was like, I don't know, it was like mid single digits at the very least. I can't even remember how young I was.
I spent nearly 2 decades shuffling from one rigidly scheduled cavalcade of expectations to another, my so-called free time still defined by homework and test prep. Almost 80% of the time I've been a sentient person for has been spent in the structure of school. It's completely reasonable that my brain has a lot of muscle memory about it, which might help explain the enduring popularity of the fictional setting, the super school. One of the foundational principles of writing is the adage to what you know, which encourages writers to draw from personal experience as they construct fantastical, speculative, and broadly fictional stories to play.
Yeah, I mean, almost everybody's gone to school. I mean, there are like very few people in some parts of the world who don't, but generally we're trying to get them to that point where they do.
Play with, because writing drawn from things the author is personally familiar with has the tendency to be more vibrant and immersive than a completely fantastical concept being built from the ground up. And of course, it's also frequently advisable to write a story with a setting that your audience can understand, and maybe even imagine themselves in, enabling a story to pull double duty as a form of imaginative escapism. For both of these reasons, writers aiming at a YA or younger audience are frequently drawn to one of the easy cold reads for that age range. Those kiddos probably know a thing or two about going to school. Setting a story in a regular school is a risky play. Most kids look to stories to think about anything else but school, and it's generally accepted that most people find school to be a mixed experience. The tropes of the mundane school life are a handful of high highs and a lot of low lows, and the highs tend to be things like prom or the big game or graduation or summer vacation, notably the parts of school that are conspicuously not school.
I never went to prom. I just didn't want to. But what were my favorite subjects were history, science, yeah, that was basically it. Any flavor of those I had a lot of fun in. Ones that I didn't, math, English, religion. Yeah, that sort of flavor of stuff. In fact, I've said it once before, but I remember once in high school, during a history class, I told my teacher that, we were covering the World War II section of history. And I'd said that the next day I'd bring in my remote control tank. Like for both me and my brother, we both have remote control tanks. I have a Sherman, he has a Tiger, and they shoot like lasers at each other. And they'll like, if you hit, they go like and shake and stuff. It's really funny. But yeah, I brought them in and we moved all the desks to the outer wall of the room. And then we spent like a good portion of the class just taking turns having like tank fights in the middle of the class, like taking like books and like binders and making terrain and like walls and stuff. That had to be the best class of my life.
Tropes of school itself are generally very unflattering. The cafeteria food, it's gotta be nasty. The homework, it's exhausting if the heroes even do it, and a recipe for trouble if they don't. The reading assignments, boring and confusing. The teachers, usually mean. The classroom experience, awkward and overwhelming. And this bad reputation, while obviously dramatized, exists for a reason. Real school, for all its many merits, is an environment that sticks a bunch of kids figuring themselves out from the ground up into a pressure cooker of expectations that they can neither escape from nor control. And when those kids grow up, the good memories and the benefits of their education are often tempered with the background radiation of constant unpleasantness that they went through in the process.
Background radiation of constant unpleasantness. That is a good description. I'm stealing that.
But you know what would be fun? A school that wasn't like that. A school dedicated to teaching something you thought was rad, like magic or giant robots. A school with a sky-high budget for field trips and good cafeteria food and gorgeous walkable campuses and clean, expansive dorms. A school that would guarantee you an exciting future in something glamorous and fun, like magic or giant robots. A school that didn't keep you from your adventures. A school that was an adventure. A super school, you might say.
Yeah.
The super school is an extremely common setting for kids in YA stories with fantastical premises. It's a fun wish fulfillment location for our hero to spend most of their time in, and it's conveniently populated with a huge crop of characters that share an age and an interest with our protagonist. The super school is great from a writer's standpoint because it provides a starter set of everything a story needs in one convenient package. Friends and allies that don't need individual motivations to justify them sticking around in the plot, enemies of all flavors and power levels from neighborhood bullies to cruel teachers to legitimately dangerous outside context threats, powerful mentors with a decent chance of actually surviving the school year, an extremely convenient avenue for exposition in the form of classes about whatever makes the school unique, trials and tribulations, conflict and resolution, the expectation that our heroes will be learning and growing the whole time they're there. It's all very useful stuff, and it's conveniently bundled into the very format of the school setting. They may as well hang a sign over the door saying, "Now entering Hero's Journey Step 5. Essentially, setting a story in a school provides the writer with a gift-wrapped assortment of storytelling basics. A supporting cast already aligned with the protagonist's interests and goals, an outlet for world-building exposition, a potentially endless march of lessons to learn and challenges to overcome. In a more freeform story, it takes work to assemble a squad of protagonists all united by a common goal, and to keep them together in the long term.
Basically, that's the GM's dilemma in any game, like, well, not just any game of Dungeons and Dragons, any like tabletop game is, like, you could have these like group of like really desperate and very varied characters. What's keeping them together instead of just, going their separate ways unless they have a single target to shoot for? Especially if like you have these characters who don't actually know each other at the beginning of the campaign or something.
It takes work to explain why a mentor is trusted to guide the protagonist and why they can't solve their problems for them. It takes work to exposit the setting's world building in an organic and natural way. It takes work to introduce new characters and introduce them into the plot going forward. A lot of back-end logistics need to get done to hold a story together in the equivalent of an open world setting. But if you set the story in a structured environment that is literally designed to challenge the people in it, you eliminate a lot of those
way of describing school, all right?
Of course, there's a trade-off, and that trade is freedom for formula. Stories set in super schools may have a lot of the setting and establishing work done for them at the outset, but as a result, they often hit a very consistent set of story beats along the way. In super school, an audience can pretty quickly start predicting what they're gonna get. Now, since this trope draws its entire structure from something deeply, rigidly formulaic, I'm gonna take a slightly more linear approach to this discussion. Rather than running through a handful of different varieties, the super school has a pretty consistent setup across settings and genres, so we can just break down the beats almost every single super school story hits. To start off, in the anatomy of a super school, the beating heart of the
gimmick,
setting
yeah.
is the gimmick. This is what makes the school super and sets it apart from a normal and presumably less appealing school experience. And this is also what powers the escapism inherent in the trope. The gimmick can be almost anything, but it usually falls into one of three categories: a highly niche field of expertise, a secret world urban fantasy, or a spec-fic high. In the highly niche field cases, the school is focused on a real subject. It's just not one that there are real specialized schools for.
Oh god, I completely forgot that there is that one season of Yu-Gi-Oh! Set in a school made entirely for dueling. That was so long ago. Oh god, what was it? I remember. I wish I could remember the episode. I remember there was one episode they were fighting like a spirit or something where it turned two of the characters into a dinosaur and a car, respectively. That was a weird episode, and I've never been able to find it again. I have no idea if I just imagined that entire thing. But two, the one thing I remember somebody pointing out afterwards, online or something, was how are any of the kids who've gone to this school prepared for the real world, at all? Granted, I know the Yu-Gi-Oh world is, it's the normal world. I mean, normal, quote unquote, but just, with a lot more card games stuffed into it. But the only thing that these kids learned in this school was Yu-Gi-Oh! Dueling. That was it. I don't even think they learned about any other, kind of games or anything. No math, no English, nothing. At least with, some of these other schools, you could, make the assumption that they would at least be, useful in the world. Like Harry Potter, for example. You have obviously how to do spells, how to you have defense against the dark arts, of course, self-defense, that sort of thing. Then you have other stuff having to deal with how to deal with magical creatures and magical plants. I mean, granted, to a Muggle society, the school is next to useless. But for a magical wizard society, I would suspect that that's a lot of useful stuff. Again, out of all these magical schools, I think that this one is the most. Wait a second, Food Wars. Right, yeah, I forgot about Food Wars as well. That was an entire school based around cooking. Which again, that one's more useful than the dueling school. I see what I'm saying here? The dueling school was the most useless out of all of these super schools.
Students in these settings will be getting an education in something like card games, or golf, or ninja training. The only innately fantastical thing about the setting is that a school this specific even exists. Secret World Urban Fantasy schools make the super school part of a hidden magical world running in parallel alongside a much more realistic and mundane world. This can be flavored in several different ways: wizards, monsters, superheroes, anything fantastical that's being kept hidden from the world at large.
Oh wait, that Winx Club, yeah, I forgot that was a show. I never watched that show. I never liked the art style. It was just, me being a little boy at the time when I was watching it, it's ew, girl show, I don't want to watch it. Same thing why I never watched Powerpuff Girls. Because, I was completely unaware of just how awesome the show actually was. And just because because the three main characters were girls, I didn't want to watch it because I was a boy.
In these stories, the students typically enter the secret world and the school at the same time, learning about the secret fantastical setting at the same time they get their acceptance letter. And in the case of Spec-Fic High, the gimmick of the school is something that doesn't exist in the real world, but is widely understood in the fictional setting and is a known and accepted part
giant
of reality.
robots.
Students might attend Spec-Fic High to learn about piloting giant robots, or hunting monsters, or flying spaceships, or other fun skill sets that don't have dangers in the real world. The gimmick of the school is basically the premise of the entire story in miniature, so it's gotta be grabby. This is why our hero is attending super school, and by extension, what they hope to learn there. Of course, first they have to get in, and this is usually an unnecessarily challenging trial for something that is ultimately a foregone conclusion. If a story is set in a super school, the protagonist is gonna get in. But that means the writer has a free license to make the admissions process as needlessly convoluted and implausibly hostile as they want, forcing the protagonist to run a gauntlet of trials or duels or tests, even though they've often invited them personally to attend, making this all rather dissonant. These tests are also often explicitly unfair, either skewed by a teacher who holds an immediate and irrational grudge against the protagonist, or just deeply unbalanced all on its own. Sometimes they're also secret tests of character that claim to be testing for one thing but are actually testing for another. This gives the protagonist an opportunity to demonstrate their natural talent and skill if they breeze through this blatantly unfair system with flying colors, but never fear, even if the protagonist fails the test, which does often happen to give them a little dark Dark Night of the Soul as a treat, the highest authority in the school will inevitably step in and let them pass anyway. They'll usually say it's because they admire the protagonist's fighting spirit or heroism or underdog gumption or whatever, but really it's because the protagonist's entry into the school is a foregone conclusion to make the plot happen, and this whole trial is taking place in the no consequences zone, which is why it can be so overwhelmingly skewed against
consequences zone, right?
Is guaranteed, even if the protagonist doesn't know that. That's storytelling for you. As soon as the protagonist...
Actually, you know, I've been thinking while watching this, have there been any, like, stories set in, like, a super school of, like, some description where it's from, like, a teacher's perspective? Because, like, I can just imagine a story where it takes place from the teacher's perspective while they're seeing all of, like, the plot beats or the hijinks of, like, what would normally happen in a show or story based in a super school happen, and them having to deal with all the paperwork that happens as a result. Because, like, what was it? I know... Like, because, like, I remember, like, years ago, it's kind of toned down now a little bit, but for a long time, like, an isekai anime, getting hit by a truck was, like, the #1 way of being sent to another world. And then somebody made a manga where the main character was the truck driver, whose job it was specifically to hit people with his magically enhanced truck to send them to other worlds to be heroes. I want to see the other side of the super school coin.
Protagonist sets foot on campus, and sometimes even a little before that, they will meet their first friend. They'll accumulate a small handful of these before the end of the day, but their first one will almost inevitably be an even more underdoggy bully magnet than the protagonist, a lovable wimp in over their head who's being pushed around aimlessly by the tides of fate until the protagonist swoops in to fill her life with the "excuse me, he asked for no pickles" energy they've been craving. In the rare cases that this doesn't happen, it's because the protagonist is the aforementioned massive wimp bully magnet, and they're about to be befriended by the hero of a different story. Soon enough, they'll accumulate a small posse of on average 2 to 4 friends, filling some or all of the roles of a typical 5-man band. The only mandatory slot to fill is the smart guy, as one of the friends will be an exceptionally talented student who knows what's up and can explain the setting to the audience surrogate protagonist who has no idea what's going on.
You know, these stories can be really fun, but it is kind of depressing when you see stories from, like, this super zoomed out lens, like when, like, somebody's deconstructing like this, and you just see just how paint by numbers it can be sometimes. Granted, some of the joy that you can get from these series is always going to be how those, like, paint by numbers sections are, like, twisted or molded into, like, a new and interesting way. But again, the fact that there's a paint by numbers section at all is kind of depressing.
Either simultaneous to meeting their first friend or very shortly thereafter, our hero will encounter their first bully. This person will be mean and smug, with at least 2 hangers-on flanking them to laugh at all their jokes, and they'll usually be introduced bullying wimpy friend #1. They come from an affluent family, are generally desperate to impress one or both parents, and almost always immediately develop a massive personal rivalry with the hero that generally turns into a long-term mutual respect friendly nemesis dynamic that can always be relied on for a little easy character conflict, but it sometimes speeds into a quick-o redemption arc for the bully instead, usually when they decide parental approval isn't all it's cracked up to be and being mean feels bad. However, our hero will generally encounter more than one bully over the course of their tenure at school, and they fall into 4 categories. The first, containing the inevitable first bully, are jerks with something to prove. These guys have someone they're trying to impress, be it a parent or teacher or just the other students, and they think throwing their weight around is the way to do it. Less complex but frequently nastier are the garden variety goons, who are just generally unpleasant and mean fellow students who contribute to making the school feel somewhat hostile. These guys are often nameless and interchangeable and exist only to cause problems. Because of that, they usually don't get graced with a redemption arc. They're just generally mean, and then they just don't show up anymore. Then there are the ones who are hostile for a reason. Characters that have a bone to pick with the protagonist, a reason to dislike them, a thing they're trying to get from them, etc., etc. These guys often turn into friends as soon as that reason is cleared up, but that's not a guarantee. And finally, there are legitimate villains, bullies that aren't just mean, they're actually bad guys, usually some combination of working for an outside villain and or infiltrating the school for their own reasons. These last guys tie in with a broader element of super school stories that is almost always present, the outside threat. Generally, the stakes within the school setting are fairly artificial. A character might be struggling with a test or detention, but the bad consequences if they mess up are purposefully contrived. They might be punished by a teacher or receive a grade they aren't happy with, but it's constrained within a system that is designed to account for their failure. But outside the school are real bad guys that don't care about school rules or regulations and have plans outside of who's going to prom with whom. The outside threat often makes its first appearance by interrupting a class field trip, forcing the students and any attending teachers to use their training in a real combat situation. But field trips are far from the only stuff.
Okay, actually, here's one thing. This was like this whole, like, outside threat sort of thing was the one reason I stopped watching Food Wars. especially at the time, I was a real fan of the whole, like, underdog is actually the overdog trait. You know, like the trait where everybody's constantly underestimating the capabilities of the protagonist, and they're just like massively better than anybody else, but everybody keeps thinking that they suck. But the thing that turned me off of that show was when I'm forgetting now, it's been a few years since I watched, but you have this guy come in and he starts taking over the school to like force like a very specific way of fine dining and like cooking as like the proper way of cooking food or something, because he's like obsessed to an almost like sexual uncomfortable degree with the protagonist's dad and his cooking ability. It was really weird, and and like soon after that plot started, that's when I dropped the show, just because I was so tired of that plot, because up at that point I had never seen the underdog is actually an overdog trait, and I didn't want the whole fighting for the spirit of the school thing, because I was getting kind of tired of that one at that point. So maybe I should try to go back and try to finish Food Wars now. I don't actually know how it ends.
Stock adventure our hero will experience within the safe confines of school. For one thing, there's class. Despite being statistically the thing our hero will spend most of their school time doing, it's actually a complete 50-50 shot if it's ever
whether you actually see them in the class.
For the simple reason that watching a character sit silently in a classroom while a teacher tells them things is not automatically interesting to watch. But while class
the funny thing about that,
classism won't be. Super schools love having some kind of internal hierarchy system the students can be sorted into, be it dorms or houses or tracks, with one slice of the hierarchy reserved for the privileged assholes and another dingier slice reserved for the scrappy underdogs. Our hero will inevitably find themselves in scrappy underdog house along with their closest friends, and conflict will inevitably ensue. Of course, when our hero eventually breaks the rules obviously enough to get caught, they will find themselves
with your homework next time,
patented detention that violates the Geneva Conventions. This will provide the conflict for the episode by being somewhere on the spectrum from frustrating to absolutely unconscionable. The danger level of the detention might be increased by machinations of the obligatory teacher that doesn't like the hero, or possibly outside intervention from bad guys, but its base level of badness is often pretty ridiculous, frequently inexplicably so.
That is a thing that happens in like super schools a lot. Why is detention supposed to be a punishment? It's not supposed to be like permanent.
The story feels like mixing things up and leading into the character drama
fodder,
episode. The school will put on a big dance, usually something prom adjacent, and let all the protagonists get dolled up in fun outfits and pair off with their respective love interests for some ship teasing. The odds of the big dance being interrupted by villainous machinations are moderately low, but never zero. And those villainous interruptions are no joke. In fact, they usually increase in severity until the story eventually reaches a breaking point of the school under siege. This stock storyline can play out in a few different ways, but in general it signals a turning point in the story where the super school, hitherto a bastion of safety and artificial stakes, becomes compromised by the real threats of the outside world, endangering the students and upping the danger level of the story as a whole. This disruptive shift in the status quo is often traumatic and frightening, as the heroes are exposed to levels of peril that the story previously protected them from just by virtue of tone. It's not uncommon for the school under siege to kick off a plotline where the hero or heroes actually leave the school and start adventuring in the wider world, leaving the pretenses of the setting behind and exploring the actual grand-scale threats that have been hiding beyond the walls. The school under siege is typically a darkest hour, as the heroes realize how truly dangerous the world they live in is, and how much they were being shielded by their teachers and faculty, but at the same time how thin those walls really were, and how ephemeral the safety they promised. But don't worry, when the story needs a grand finale, they'll probably come back to
just come back to school.
Now, there's a few other stock elements of this trope that can be reliably expected to turn up in super school stories, but we've run down most of the really consistent bits already. And while it may sound like these stories are very formulaic, which isn't entirely wrong, there's still a lot of room for narrative freedom in and around the confines of this setting. For one thing, a super school story doesn't need to spend all its time in the school. The protagonist can have regular adventures outside of it, with the super school being only one place they go for plot.
Exactly, because I mean, unless it's like modeled after one of those fancy like faraway schools, or it's based off like a college or a university, you know, most of the time the character will live, you know, in an actual house somewhere else and have a life outside of school.
And outside rules and regulations of the super school, the hero can get up to basically anything. And the consistent parts of the story are consistent for a reason. It really is very convenient for the writer to have access to a massive cast of characters, allies, enemies, and everything in between, just on call whenever they need them because they're all on campus together. And the very nature of a school setting provides the protagonist with an endless parade of small-scale conflicts and challenges. The characters can at any time be struggling with a lesson, prepping for or making up a test, swamped with homework, training, stuck in detention, wrangling a bully, or whatever. The purpose of a school is to challenge its students, so it's very easy for a writer to wrangle a challenge out of the system of the school. The characters will never be bored, so the audience won't either. Right? Well,
again, I bring you back to my previous statements about Food Wars.
These pros come with cons. Episodic also means formulaic, and even if we disregard the problems of repetition in storytelling, the stakes established within the boundaries of the super school are artificial, and can realistically only get so perilous before it becomes implausible that the adults and authority figures are not intervening. If a super school has stakes that are too high and too interesting, it can circle around to seeming both unbelievable and not all that fun. Now don't get me wrong, an escapist story doesn't need to pamper its protagonists with nothing but positivity. Half the fun of escapism is imagining oneself overcoming unimaginable peril in cool cinematic ways. But there's a difference between excitingly dangerous and frustratingly unfair. And if a super school stakes get
the best friend is still like that.
Mean, it can start feeling like it'd be more trouble than it was worth to deal with it. But of course, if the school stakes are too low, that just reminds the audience that the whole conflict is fundamentally unreal, even within the space of the story. The stakes are impressing or disappointing a teacher, not anything tangibly meaningful. And more broadly, the characters are almost always going to be at their most interesting when they're outside the bounds of the regular school schedule. Characters actively in class can't exactly do much chatting. Characters between classes can't do much beyond brief chats. So most character shenanigans have to happen after or outside of school, making the primary setting of the story an active hindrance to the plot a lot of the time. Not much more than an inciting incident and a common goal to keep the heroes hanging out with each other. But there almost always comes a time when the heroes leave the super school behind, when they enter the wider world of complex stakes and unstructured time and genuine threats. And that's usually when the story starts getting really good. The characters get the chance to discover who they are when they aren't being defined by scores.
Why is she always crying?
They get to choose their destiny, prepared by their schooling for a big scary world of adventure. After all, the one truth of every school is that one day every student will stop being a student and get the chance to be a person instead. And I gotta say, being a person's a lot more fun. So, yeah.
Oh, the magic of TV tropes, eh? But yeah, just thinking about it, it really, after like watching all this and having it come back to me, just how often the super school in some flavor actually did appear in media and stuff like that. Again, I'm gonna have to like go back to a couple of these shows that I stopped watching when I was younger, like Food Wars and such, just to see like how they actually end, because you know I'm older, I'm a changed person. Hopefully it won't bother me as much the second time around. But yeah, with all that being said, original video is linked in the description if you haven't seen it for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day. And with all that out of the way, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.